The dog tag was still warm. That is the detail survivors remembered. Not the smoke, not the screaming, not the burning half-tracks scattered across the floor of Kasserine Pass like discarded toys. They remembered that the metal was still body-warm when they pulled it from the mud. Private First Class Raymond Cook, 19 years old, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The tag was warm because it had been around his neck 30 seconds earlier, when he was alive, February 20th, 1943. Tunisia, North Africa. In 48 hours, Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps had done something the German High Command had whispered was possible, but no one had dared say aloud. They had broken the United States Army in open battle. Not bent it, not slowed it, broken it. 2. Corps lost over 6,500 men in 6 days. They abandoned 183 tanks, 208 artillery pieces, and enough equipment to outfit a division. American soldiers fled so fast that the German supply columns couldn't keep pace with the retreat. Rommel stood at the pass and said what he had believed since the Americans arrived in Africa. He wrote it. His staff passed it around. He would crush Patton before Eisenhower could react, and then the Mediterranean would belong to the Axis. He was wrong. But here's the question this video will answer. The question that doesn't make sense until you've seen everything that came next. How does a beaten army, humiliated, demoralized, and mocked by the finest tank commander in German history, turn around in less than 6 weeks and hand that same enemy the most shocking defeat of the entire North African campaign? The answer has one name, and it starts on March 6, 1943. To understand what George Patton walked into in March of 1943, you have to understand what Kasserine Pass had done to the American military's soul. The strategic picture was this. Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, had begun in November 1942 with enormous promise. Narmesens. American forces had landed in Morocco and Algeria, linked up with British forces pushing west from Egypt, and the plan was simple. Trap the Axis forces between 2 Allied armies and squeeze. Tunisia would fall. Africa would be clear. Italy would be next. Then Kasserine happened. Rommel, facing encirclement, did what Rommel always did. He attacked. He hit the weakest point in the Allied line, the American sector, with concentrated armored force, and the Americans, green and overconfident and saddled with commanders who had never heard a shot fired in anger, collapsed. General Lloyd Fredendall, commanding 2 corps, directed the battle from a headquarters carved into a mountain 30 miles behind the front. He issued orders by telephone. He never visited the front. He had no idea what was happening until it had already happened. The British observed it all with barely concealed contempt. Field Marshal Harold Alexander, commanding ground forces under Eisenhower, sent a report to London that was brutally honest. American troops were, in his assessment, not yet capable of taking on seasoned German formations. He recommended they be kept in reserve. Rommel's assessment was sharper. In his diary, captured after the war, he wrote on February 23rd, "The Americans are willing enough, but they are thoroughly muddled in their thinking and do not understand the concept of concentrated force. They spread themselves thin and invite destruction in detail. I have no fear of Patton. His reputation exceeds his methods." Read that again. I have no fear of Patton. He put it in writing. On March 6, 1943, Eisenhower repasson. He put it in writing. Patton arrived at 2nd Corps headquarters in Jebel Kouf area in a jeep flying a 2-star flag, wearing his lacquered helmet, 2 ivory-handled pistols, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this moment his entire professional life. What happened in the next 72 hours was not a battle. What happened in the next 72 hours was not a battle. It was a transformation. Patton fined officers for appearing in public without their helmets and neckties. He imposed strict traffic discipline on roads that had been chaotic for months. He held officers personally responsible for the physical condition of their men. These were not vanity measures. He understood something Fredendall had never grasped. Discipline and self-respect are the same thing, and an army that is careless about small things will be careless about small things, will be careless about staying alive. Captain David Harriman, 27 years old, from Knoxville, Tennessee, commanded Company G of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, and he remembered the change in physical terms. It was like someone opened a window, Harriman later wrote in his after-action report. The air was Dickwan, someone opened a window. Harriman later wrote in his after-action report. The air was different. The way men carried themselves in the chow line was different, but different give us a slovenly. He made us ashamed to look slovenly. And that shame somehow became pride again. Harriman had fought Kasserine. He had seen men run. He had seen officers abandon their positions without orders, without reason, without anything except animal terror. He had held his own company in place through 2 days of German armor by the narrowest margin, and he had come out of it hollow, like something essential had been scooped from the center of him. He was 27 years old, and he moved like a much older man. His unit, Company G, was 23 men understrength after Kasserine. He had one star sergeant he trusted completely, Harold Buck Fitzgerald, 31, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, former steelworker, who could read terrain like a book and had the additional quality, priceless in an NCO, of never appearing frightened even when he almost certainly was. He had 2 new lieutenants who had been in Africa for 11 days. And he had a mission. The objective was the high ground south of El Gheta, a town in central Tunisia, sitting at the junction of 3 valleys, commanding the road to Gabsa. Whoever held that ridge held the keys to central Tunisia. The 1st Infantry Division's assignment was to seize El Gheta by March 17th, hold it, and establish a defensive line that would force the Axis to react. The intelligence briefing said the enemy at El Gheta was Italian, specifically the Centauro Armored Division, with no significant German armor in reserve closer than 40 miles. The road through the Maknassi Valley was assessed as clear. A French-Moroccan reconnaissance unit had swept it 2 days prior and reported no contact. Captain Harriman studied the map for a long time, then he studied it again. The valley floor was too flat. The drainage patterns on the topographic sheet didn't match what he'd seen in the photographs. Either the map was wrong, or the photographs were from a different season when wadis ran differently. He flagged it to his battalion commander. The response came back from regiment. The intelligence is solid. The French report is reliable. Proceed on schedule. Harriman noted his concern in his journal that night, March 16, 1943. The ground doesn't read right. I've learned in this country that the map and the ground are always in argument, and the ground always wins. We will move tomorrow and find out who is right. The ground was right. March 17th. 0400 hours. Company G moved out in the dark, following a route that climbed from the El Gheta Valley floor toward the southern ridge. Harriman put Sergeant Fitzgerald's squad on point, with 2 men 15 meters ahead of the main body as ears. The night was clear and cold. Stars. No wind. The kind of silence that North African desert produces at that hour. Not peaceful silence, but empty silence. The silence of a place that has decided to wait. They had been moving for 40 minutes when Fitzgerald raised his fist. The column stopped. Fitzgerald crouched, moved to Harriman, and said 3 words. Fresh oil stain. On the track ahead. Not grease from a cart or a mule. Machine oil. Recent, the sand hadn't absorbed it yet. Yet. Something with an engine had been here, and it had been here within hours. Harriman got on the radio to battalion. Reported what they'd found. The response was 2 minutes coming, probably a French Rechi vehicle. Continue mission. Harriman told Fitzgerald to continue. Fitzgerald gave him a look that says you're the officer, and they moved forward. At 0452, the ridge above them erupted. Not one position. Not a picket line of sentries. Coordinated fire from multiple concealed positions, 2 machine guns in the rocks at 11 o'clock, a mortar that had clearly been pre-registered on the trail, and rifle fire from above and from the right flank. It wasn't a sentry who'd heard them. It was a prepared ambush from a force that had known they were coming, had chosen this ground, and had been waiting. Private First Class Antonio Vega, 22, San Antonio, Texas, was the first man hit. He was walking third from point. The burst caught him across the left side and put him down in the center of the trail, in the open, where the machine gun could reach him. Harriman screamed, "Off the trail, move left," and the company broke into the rocks on the left side. But the rocks were not as deep as they needed to be, and the mortar was already walking toward them, crump crump, each round slightly closer than the last. Sergeant Michael Oakes, squad leader, 2nd Platoon, 24 years old, Boise, Idaho, was killed by the 3rd mortar round. He was 3 feet from Harriman. He was there and then he was not. Think about what that means for the man standing next to him. Harriman got his company into cover. He counted heads. He had lost 4 men in the first 90 seconds, 2 dead, 2 wounded. Vega was still alive in the trail, unable to move. Private Chester Nowak crawled out under fire and dragged Vega back into the rocks. Nowak was hit in the shoulder doing it. He dragged Vega the rest of the way anyway. Harriman got on the radio. "Battalion, how many are you engaging?" Harriman, "Unknown." "Machine gun, mortar, at least 20 rifles. These are not Italians. The fire is coordinated." "Battalion, say again on enemy identification." Harriman, "They are Germans. The fire discipline is German. We are pinned on the south face with no covered route to the objective." There was a pause. Then the orders changed. Battalion came back on the radio and told him something that, standing in the rocks with mortar rounds falling 30 meters away, made him wonder if he was hearing correctly. Division had adjusted the operation. He was to hold his current position. The primary assault on El Getar would be executed by a different element coming through the northern valley. He was to maintain contact with the enemy in his sector and not withdraw, but also not advance. Hold. Don't advance. Don't retreat. Under fire, with 4 casualties and no supporting weapons. The enemy wasn't Italians, with no German armor nearby. Later, post-war analysis would confirm what Harriman sensed in those rocks. The Centauro Division's positions had been reinforced by elements of the 10th Panzer Division, recalled from their staging area 60 miles north, repositioned in 72 hours with the kind of speed that German operational staff had perfected across 3 years of war. The French-Moroccan reconnaissance unit had swept the road before the German reinforcements arrived. The intelligence wasn't fabricated. It was simply 36 hours old, which in Tunisia in March of 1943 was the same as saying it was ancient history. The enemy Phase 1 was still running in German headquarters. Colonel Hans-Georg Hildebrandt of the 10th Panzer's operations staff wrote in his log that day, "American infantry is behaving predictably. They have taken cover and are requesting reinforcement by radio. They will not advance. They will wait to be told what to do." He was wrong about the last part. He was about to find out how wrong. A like on this video takes 2 seconds. For the men who held that hillside under mortar fire with no cover waiting for orders that made no sense, it is the very least we can do. Harriman looked at the map. Then he looked at the ground. Then he did what Patton was 40 miles away. He stopped waiting for orders that made sense and started reading what the ground was telling him. Here is the principle. Patton had drilled it into every officer in 2 Corps during those 72 hours of transformation at Jebel Kuif, and he had not invented it. He had refined it from a lifetime of studying how battles are actually won, as opposed to how they are designed to be won. The principle was this: an obstacle is not a stop sign. It is information. The specific Patton formulation from his notes to his corps commanders in early March 1943, when you encounter resistance, do not push harder at the point of resistance. The resistance tells you where the enemy is strong. It therefore tells you where he is weak. Your job is not to defeat his strength, it is to find his weakness and arrive there first. This is not complicated in theory. It is agonizing in practice, because it requires a commander to stop doing the thing his instincts are screaming at him to do, which is shoot back at the thing that is shooting at him, and instead think. Harriman lay in the rocks on the south face of that Tunisian ridge, and he thought. The ambush was thorough on the south face of that Tunisian ridge, and he thought. The ambush was thorough on the south face. The machine guns had interlocking fields of fire. The mortar was pre-registered. This position had been prepared by people who knew their business. That meant they'd spent time here. That meant they had priorities. Certain avenues they considered dangerous and certain avenues they considered negligible. They had not put fire on the western draw. It was a narrow defile, maybe 12 meters wide, between two ridgelines dropping down the far side of the hill away from the road. It appeared on the map as essentially impassable. The contour lines ran close together, indicating steep ground. But Harriman had spent 3 months learning that Tunisian contour maps were optimistic. What the map called a cliff was often a steep scramble. What it called a draw was often a covered route. The western draw was not defended because the Germans had looked at the same map and reached the same conclusion: impassable. Patton. The ground the enemy ignores is the ground that will kill him. But before Harriman could move, there was the civilian problem. Approximately 200 meters inside the western draw, visible from his position through field glasses, was a farmhouse. Stone construction. Occupied. He could see a thread of smoke from a chimney and the movement of figures inside the courtyard. A family. Arab farmers who had stayed when the armies arrived, because where do you go when the entire country is a battlefield? Moving through that draw meant moving past that farmhouse. And if the Germans had positioned a stay-behind observer in that farm, which was a documented German tactic, then the moment his company emerged from cover, they would be reported and the ambush would simply reposition. Harriman had 2 options. He could bypass the farmhouse and accept the risk of being reported. Or he could approach the farmhouse first, expose his presence to potential German observers, make contact with the family, and determine if the building was compromised. Neither option was clean. He chose contact, not because it was safer, because the alternative was treating the family inside as acceptable collateral damage, either from German fire or from being caught between 2 forces, and he was not willing to make that calculation without at least trying. He sent Corporal James Whitfield, 20 years old, fluent in French after 2 years at Louisiana State, and 1 other man crawling along a dried stream bed toward the farmhouse, with orders to make contact quietly and identify whether any German presence was in or near the building. If this story has stayed with you, if the name David Harriman means something to you now, if this story has stayed with you, if the name David Harriman means something to you now, the channel that brings you stories like this runs on your subscription. It takes 5 seconds. It keeps this work going. Whitfield reached the farmhouse. The family, an elderly man, his daughter, and 3 children, was there. No Germans. They had left at midnight, the old man said in French, going north. He had seen them go. He had counted 11 men with a radio. 11 men. An observation post, now gone north. The draw was clear. Harriman assembled his remaining effective strength, 16 combat-capable soldiers, and they moved into the western draw at 0615, single file, weapons at low ready, every man placing his feet with the kind of care that comes from understanding that noise is death. What they were about to do had no name in the field manual. Patton would have recognized it immediately. The Germans would not recognize it at all. The draw was steeper than the map suggested, and easier than the map suggested. Both at once, the rock was solid and offered good footholds, but the angle meant anyone carrying a weapon in a pack was working hard, breathing hard, and making small sounds of exertion that sounded, in that silence, like shouts. Harriman kept them moving. 16 men, 4 dead or seriously wounded back on the south face. Vega was stable. Noack had packed his wound before being evacuated. Sergeant Fitzgerald was on Harriman's left, reading the terrain above them, with the habit of a man who has learned to keep his eyes on the high ground. Always, always, always. At 0641, they crested the draw. What they saw, and Harriman would describe this moment in his after-action report with unusual precision, because it was the kind of image that sears itself permanently, was the rear of the German ambush position. 8 men, 2 MG-42 machine guns on tripods, both oriented south, both currently firing in long bursts down at where the rest of Company G was still pinned in cover. A mortar crew of 3 behind a rock outcrop, 1 radio operator, and 20 meters further, a half-track with its engine running. A German corporal standing beside it, smoking a cigarette and looking south down the hill at the American position. The Germans had no rear security. None. They were so confident in their position, so certain that the western draw was impassable, so certain that Americans would stay pinned and wait for orders, that they had not put a single man watching their own back door. Harriman had less than 5 seconds to make a decision. He turned to Fitzgerald and said quietly, the quietest voice a man can use and still be understood, "On my shot." Machine guns first, then the mortar. Fitzgerald nodded. Harriman raised his carbine. The next 45 seconds were the loudest 45 seconds in the history of that hillside. Short sentences now, because that is how combat moves. The MG-42 crews never turned around. The mortar crew had time to stand up. The radio operator got his handset to his face and got 1 transmission out. 1 partial transmission because Corporal Whitfield, who had not left Harriman's side since the farmhouse, shot the radio before they operated his sentence. The half-track driver tried to start the engine. It was already running. He put it in gear and drove it directly into the rock wall of the draw because he had no idea which direction the fire was coming from. The German corporal with the cigarette, the one standing and watching the Americans, dropped the cigarette and ran. Harriman let him go. There were not enough men to chase him and fight simultaneously, and Harriman needed every man on those machine guns. 16 seconds. The ambush position was taken. But now Harriman had a problem that was in some ways worse than the ambush itself. He had captured 2 heavy machine guns and a mortar, which was good. He had 12 combat-effective soldiers, which was not enough. He had no radio. His set had been damaged in the initial fire on the south face. He had ammunition for approximately 40 minutes of sustained fire. And he could hear, coming from the north, the sound he had been dreading since the moment he crested that draw: engines. Not half-track engines, tank engines. German armor, responding to whatever that radio operator had managed to transmit. The distance was hard to judge in the hills, but the sound was growing. He had maybe 10 minutes. Harriman looked at his options. Option 1. Withdraw back through the draw and abandon the position. Option 1. The problem was that this left the ambush site intact for German reoccupation and surrendered everything they had just taken. Option 2. Hold the position with 12 men and 2 captured machine guns against an armored response. The problem was that machine guns do not stop tanks. He found option 3 by looking at the half-track embedded in the rock wall. The half-track carried ammunition. Specifically, it carried 4 crates of infantry ammunition, and Harriman checked this with the focused calm of a man who has gone past fear into something that feels, from the outside, like serenity. 2 Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets. The Germans had brought their own solution to the problem of German armor. Here is where it becomes important to understand what Patton's training actually produced. Harriman was not a tank destroyer specialist. He had received 1 hour of Panzerfaust familiarization during a captured weapons briefing in January. He had the instruction sheet, in German, that was attached to the weapon. And he had Sergeant Fitzgerald, who had the quality that makes men like him invaluable. He could figure out almost anything mechanical if given 3 minutes and a clear head. 2 minutes, Fitzgerald said, examining the weapon. Maybe 90 seconds. You have 90 seconds, Harriman told him. He positioned his remaining men along the ridge above the northern approach, using the captured MG-42s in reverse, now facing north toward the German response route. He staggered his riflemen at intervals. He told every man the same thing. Do not fire until I fire. When you fire, fire everything you have as fast as you can. Make them think there are 100 of us. The tanks came around the bend in the track below at 0722. 2 Panzer IVs leading a column of infantry and trucks. The lead tank was 40 meters from Harriman's position when he opened fire. Both MG-42s opened together. The rifles opened together. Whitfield threw a grenade that had no chance of damaging the tank but produced a satisfying explosion at the tray line that the following infantry immediately took cover from, buying critical seconds. The lead tank stopped when you are uncertain. You do not drive into an ambush of unknown size. Fitzgerald fired the first Panzerfaust. It missed. 18 inches wide, detonating on the road beside the tank's left track. The lead tank started moving again. Faster now, aggressive, trying to push through. Fitzgerald fired the second Panzerfaust. He hit the track. The tank slewed left, track blown, and ground to a halt blocking the road. It was not destroyed, but it was immobile, and it was now blocking the road. It was not destroyed. The German infantry and the trucks behind had dismounted and were moving into the rocks on both sides of the road, which is what trained infantry does when ambushed, and Harriman's 12 men were now engaging approximately 40 German soldiers in a firefight on a hillside above a road blocked by a disabled tank. This is the 3-to-1 ratio the crisis conditions demand. This is the math that should not work. Private First Class Arthur Clem, 19 years old, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who had been in Africa for 6 weeks and had never been under fire before Kasserine, and then been under fire every day since, was behind the left MiG-42, and he was putting 3-round bursts into the roadside rocks below, with the economy of a man who knows he has 40 minutes of ammunition and needs to make every second count. He was hit in the left arm at 0731. He switched the gun to single-hand fire, bracing it with his body, and kept firing. Harriman saw this. He saw it, and he made the decision that every commander in that situation must make. He did not pull Clem off the gun, because without that gun the position would be overrun. He moved to Clem's position, pressed a bandage against the wound with one hand, and fed the ammunition belt with the other, and they fired that gun together. The German column could not advance. The disabled tank blocked the road. The infantry probes were being driven back by fire from a position they could not accurately identify. And at 0747, something happened that Harriman did not expect and could not have planned. From the south, through the El Guetar Valley, he heard American artillery. The northern assault division had been advancing the whole time. The artillery was adjusting for the forward elements. The German column, caught in the ambush and now hearing American guns opening to their south, received orders through the surviving radio, the corporal who had run, who had apparently reached another position and transmitted, to disengage and reform north of the ridge. They withdrew. At 0810, Captain David Harriman, 12 men, and 2 American soldiers who were technically no longer combat capable but had decided not to let that stop them, held a ridge south of El Guetar that the German 10th Panzer Division's operational log had listed as strongly held by forward elements. It was held, but not by who the log said. In German headquarters, Colonel Hildebrandt sent a message at 0830 that afternoon. American infantry at South Ridge is operating outside doctrinal parameters. Cannot confirm numbers. Fire volume suggests battalion strength. Recommend immediate reinforcement of northern route. There were 12 men on that ridge. 1 had a destroyed arm. They had ammunition for roughly 8 more minutes of sustained fire when the Germans pulled back. Aftermath does not smell like triumph. It smells like cordite and blood and the particular ozone smell of overheated machine gun barrels. It looks like exhausted men sitting against rocks, not talking, some of them staring at hands that will not quite stop shaking. It looks like the specific quiet of a position that has been fought over and is now, temporarily, not being fought over, which is a different thing entirely from peace. El Guettar fell to the 1st Infantry Division by March 17, 1943. The extended battle for the surrounding ridges and valleys continued through March and into April. Rommel himself was already gone, evacuated from Africa on March 9, citing illness, which was partly true and partly the acknowledgement of a man who understood that the tide had shifted and did not want to be present for what came next. The battle became one of the first clear American tactical victories against German regulars in the European theater. But what the enemy said afterward tells the story more clearly than any American account. General Jürgen von Arnim, commanding Axis forces in Tunisia after Rommel's departure, wrote in his post-campaign analysis, captured by Allied forces in May 1943, "The American soldier at El Guettar demonstrated qualities we had not anticipated after Kasserine. They adapted. When their positions were compromised, they did not withdraw, and they did not simply absorb the blow. They found angles of attack that our defensive planning had not considered. I must attribute this partly to the change in American command. Patton's influence was visible in how their junior officers behaved. They were not waiting for orders. They were deciding. The colonel who had written that the Americans would not advance, Hildebrandt, left a longer post-war account. He wrote in 1948, interviewed by the U.S. Army Historical Division, "I was wrong about them. I was wrong specifically about their capacity to act when their plan had failed. German doctrine produced excellent soldiers who executed plans beautifully. American doctrine, Patton's doctrine, seemed to produce soldiers who were most dangerous precisely when the plan had failed. That is a different kind of soldier. It took us too long to understand the difference." Read those words from a German colonel who spent the rest of the war trying to stop what he had dismissed at the start. Captain David Harriman received the Silver Star. Sergeant Harold Fitzgerald received the Bronze Star. Private First Class Arthur Clem, who fired an M42 with one functional arm, received a Bronze Star and lost the use of 2 fingers on his left hand, which he described in a letter home to his mother in Milwaukee, dated April 3, 1943. This way, 2 fingers is not so bad, Ma. The ones I lost weren't my trigger fingers. I checked. Patton, receiving the after-action reports from El Guettar, said nothing formal or inspiring. He reviewed the reports, made notes in the margins, and sent one line back to the 1st Infantry Division commander, General Terry Allen. They finally understood the lecture. Good. He was satisfied. Not exuberant. Satisfied. Not exuberant. Satisfied. Not exuberant. Because to Patton, this was not a miracle. It was the expected outcome of soldiers who had been taught to think rather than merely to follow. The miracle would have been if they hadn't done it. The lesson is embedded in what you've just watched, but stated plainly anyway. Kasserine Pass was not a failure of American courage. It was a failure of American doctrine, specifically the doctrine that assumed if you gave soldiers a perfect plan, the battle would unfold according to that plan. Patton understood, with a clarity that bordered on obsession, that plans do not survive contact with the enemy. What survives is the quality of the mind inside the soldier when the plan is gone. An obstacle is not a stop sign. An obstacle is information. The ambush tells you where the enemy is strong, and therefore tells you where he is weak. The bad intelligence doesn't end the mission. It changes the orders that don't make sense, aren't the end of the road. They're the beginning of the decision that only you can make. That is the Patton principle, not the pearl-handled pistols, not the speeches, that. The ridge south of El Guettar is still there. The farmhouse that Corporal Whitfield reached in the dark, crawling along a stream bed, is gone, but the stone foundation remains, visible from the road that runs through the valley where the 10th Panzer Division's column sat blocked behind a burning tank, unable to understand how 12 Americans had done what 12 Americans had done. What 12 Americans had done. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the North African Theater, in 2 Corps, in the 1st Infantry Division, in any of the tank destroyer or artillery battalions that fought through Tunisia in the spring of 1943, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What campaign? Where did they end up? Those stories live in family memory, and nowhere else. They deserve to be written down. Rommel said he would crush Patton before Eisenhower could react. What Patton did was simpler and harder and more lasting than any single battle. He taught an army to think,